I'm so paranoid about that in the summer. If
Yeah,
ever I'm
I'm
top dressing urea, I'm like just like looking at the weather and I get it down. I'm like staring at the sky. I'm like, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Start
yeah,
raining now, start raining now. And then like if it doesn't, I'm like sweating and I'm like, oh. And then I wonder how much I lost. You know, it's like if it didn't rain, I'm like, did I lose half? I mean, I can't tell. I'm like, do I need to go do it again? It's just like, oh, it drives me crazy.
Welcome to the Just Hunt podcast.
All right, everybody. Welcome to episode 6 of the Just Hunt podcast. Today we have a guest, another northern guest, not a northeastern guest, but I guess, what would you call that? The upper northwest, John?
yeah, just north, I
Just
guess.
north, yeah.
Yeah.
So John's in Minnesota. He is the owner of Frigid Forage, which is a food plot company, seed company that we've worked with for a long time. It's got to be, what year is it? It's got to be over a decade that I've been planting your seeds.
Yeah.
Back in the Midwest whitetail days, we planted it, and then really haven't really stopped. They've worked really well for us, and John's got a lot of knowledge on food plots and kind of northern settings, and want to dive a little bit into I know the wolf situation in Minnesota, which is interesting because, you know, I think that we have it bad in the Northeast. We have poor soils and low deer densities and poor habitat and small antlers for the most part, but we don't have wolves, so I'm thankful for that. And I know that's a huge impact. We don't have wolves or cats.
We got some to spare if you need some.
Yeah. Okay. John, why don't you give us a quick, I guess, background on yourself and particularly the company and how that got started?
Well, I shortly after I got out of college, way back in '87, I kind of got interested into opening a hunting lodge, and so I started working on that. Took a few years to get it going. We finally, so in 1992 is when I finally got things rolling. '93 was our first year, so we were kind of north central Minnesota. Focused primarily on pheasant hunting, but
Okay.
we also were getting into whitetail hunting. And back then, you know, in the 80s and in early 90s and stuff, you know, was whitetail hunting, of course, was popular, but nothing like it is today. And used to do a lot of the food plots and things geared primarily towards holding pheasants.
Mm-hmm.
But because we had, you know, good deer hunting on our property and kind of started doing things, you know, some for deer too. And back then, even, you know, planting soybeans was pretty, you know, outside the box. You know,
Yeah.
what people did for deer hunting. Most people didn't even plant food plots. Things like rape, stuff like that, weren't even, you know, in anybody's
Right.
vocabulary yet. So anyway, and we did some deer hunting. You know, we had a lodge, but the deer hunting season was, you know, a couple weeks of rifle season. That didn't get a lot of archery hunters back then.
Yeah.
And so that just kind of morphed into, you know, then in 2008, I had been using Frigid Forage and had the opportunity to buy the company in 2008.
Okay.
So did that. Tough financial times right then. You know, that's when a lot of the housing market was crashing. It was kind of a little bit of a scary time to get started in a new business, but everything has worked out. So I took a lot of the knowledge that we had over the years, planting for pheasants, things like that, kind of took it in. That's where we developed the plot screen mix.
Yep.
You know, we used to plant stuff that was attractive, you know, to keep in the pheasants, but then could also hold up to a lot of hunters walking through it, the snow, things like that.
What did you mainly plant for? I mean, I know the plot screen mix. There's some Egyptian wheat and some sorghum in there. Is that like the mainstay of a pheasant food? I guess I'm not really familiar with that. What was like your program for that?
Well, we used to plant a lot of millet. Millet
Okay. Yep.
is great for birds, but you look at millet sideways and it falls over, you know, so it couldn't handle
Yep.
any snow, any trap, you know, everybody who walked through it, you could see exactly where they walked. So then we started planting other things with it, you know, tried some of the shorty corn, you know, but it seemed like grain sorghum, you know, and those
Yeah.
worked about the best. You know, they had a thick stalk and they could, and you know, if we got a lot of snow and a lot of that, so that's kind of where that came. And then we did some a little bit taller, you know, tried things like sunflowers, you know, anything like that. So then when it came time to kind of take that and take it to the you know, into the deer hunting and just making a screen out of it, you know, we kind of did the opposite. We planted the short stuff to keep the tall stuff going, you know. So then we looked at trying to get different heights of sorghum, Sudan grasses, you know, Egyptian wheat being the tallest. And again, that was another one. You know, it would grow beautiful and get up 12 feet tall, but the first snowfall, you know, it'd be flat to the ground. So
doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of stuff that stands up to the snow.
No,
it's very selective.
And the ice is worse. It's that early season, you know, where it starts as rain and then freezes, turns over. That's probably the worst for it. That'll pull just about anything down, you know. So and what happens a lot with the plots green, you know, the top ones break over, you know, and they run, but they still make a nice, you know, we found that 10 to 12 feet is kind of a sweet spot for it. If it gets much taller than that, it gets, you know, it's more susceptible to falling down, you know, and if it starts at 10, 12, settles down to 6, 8, that's still a pretty effective screen.
Yeah. That makes sense. So on the lodge side, so I'm just curious, what was the makeup of that? Did you have like a bunch of private ground, or what did the lodge sit on as far as like property?
Yep. We had our own ground, that we did the pheasant hunting on and the deer hunting on. And then we also, we were I don't know if the program's still going, but we were an Orvis endorsed grouse hunting lodge for several years there too. And then for that we used, like we bordered a 40,000 acre wildlife management area. So we did that. And that's where we did some of our deer hunting stuff too, and bear hunting and things. And then we also had, you know, a lot of, you know, at that time too, you know, aspen, you know, a lot of popple cuts, a lot of that kind of stuff. So the grouse hunting, you know, and the Mille Lacs Wildlife Management areas where they had done a lot of studies on the grouse and things. So it was all good habitat for that, but they're very cyclical. So it is kind of hard sometimes, you know, when they're on their low end of their cycle, you know, you get, you know, to bring grouse hunters in, you know, and you know, all our costs were the same, you know, for the guides and the food and the lodging. But so we had built a nice lodge with, you know, bedrooms, and we did everything, you know, for the lodging, foods, you know, everything.
Can you describe that area that you're in, or maybe are you still on the same property, or are you?
No, in 2019 we moved up to some other property we had up in Bemidji, Minnesota, which is up in the northwest corner, not too far from Canada. Kind of the claim to fame of Bemidji, where the headwaters are the Mississippi.
Okay. Yep.
And now I live on the Mississippi. We have a little bit smaller. We got 170 acres, you know, and about a mile of Mississippi River frontage. And now we're mainly in a lot of pine country, sandy, you know, a lot of hills and bluffs, which is a lot different than central Minnesota, which is very flat. You know, on the 400 and some acres that we had down there, I mean, the elevation probably changed 2 feet. It's either swamp or just above swamp.
Yep, I know an area like that. My farms in Western New York are very similar. So what was the snowfall like, or the winters where you started and then where you are now? Were they similar, or what was the difference?
They vary so much, and I mean they still do. You know, we have years of, you know, and for us a lot of snowfall, and then the cold, you know, is what we get now. You know, we can get some really tough winters where it's already belly deep, you know, by the end of October, early November, and like up in Bemidji where we're at now. The same snow is on the ground in April that was there in November. It doesn't go anywhere. We don't get the thaws. We don't get rains. So it just continues to stack. In central Minnesota, you know, it's a little bit different down there, but we also did a lot of, you know, sometimes you kind of wish for snow. We did a lot of snowmobile groups, things like that too, that would come through the lodge in the wintertime. But you could always depend on the cold. You just can't always depend on the snow.
Yeah. How much snow do you guys have on the ground right now, John?
Maybe a foot, you know.
So
it's been a cold year. We just had this past week, you know, I don't know, the coldest was the one morning they'd said was 31 below, and then add in the wind chill, and that put us at 50 below.
Yeah, it doesn't
but
often
we've
get
had some
here.
stretches like that. Yeah. That's our second was this year. So
we definitely have more than a foot of snow, but I'd say we rarely see 30 below. I mean,
Yeah.
It may get 10, 15 below with maybe past that with a wind chill. But,
Yeah.
I mean, if you get up north towards the Canadian border, which is like 3 to 4 hours from where we're at now,
Yeah.
I've seen 40 below up there. We have a cabin that's 7 miles from the border. But it's been like 20 years since I've seen that. So that's cold. It seems like you have colder winters than us. Maybe we have a touch more snowfall. Seems like the same thing. We have this, our snow just like the snow we have now isn't leaving until April for sure. Like just accepted it. Sometimes you'll get an early snow and then a little warm up and maybe you'll lose it. But it seems like when you get in mid-January to into February, if you have that snow, it's not going anywhere. So
that's kind of how the last couple winters have gone. We get like dumped on and then it'll warm up and it always kind of stays ahead of it. But this year we've been getting pounded the last few weeks for sure.
Yeah. I was going to say last year it was an abnormal year. It was very warm, and we had very little snow, which was great. The deer herd needed that so bad because we had back-to-back very severe winters, that really took our numbers down. And so we needed that, but it takes more than 1 year, to rebound the herd, anything like that. And then, so this year has been kind of in between, they can handle the cold
right.
if the snow isn't so deep.
Yep.
So that's kind of where we're at now.
How much have you seen the herd change the last couple of years with those winters? What are they telling you that the numbers are at versus what they were?
Yeah, what they tell you, or what you see. And up where we're at, it definitely, and they even admitted it that the northwestern part of the state was still rebounding. But our deer numbers, I don't know what you guys have compared to. What your deer density numbers are, when you say low deer density, what they manage for and things like that are pretty low compared to a lot of states. They can be anywhere from 11 to 15 deer per square mile is kind of what they manage.
Yeah, a lot of northern New England is single-digit deer per square mile. It just depends as you get further south. And west. It seems like the density on my New York farms is very high. I mean, there's high deer densities. It's very different from here. But you get up in the northern Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and I mean, you're talking single digits deer per square mile for sure. Mm-hmm. And then everywhere in between, obviously it's habitat dependent too. There's some areas with some cuts and a lot of food where you get a little bit higher. They're pocketed, but I'd say in general it's pretty low. Probably similar to you over the whole New England as a whole. Obviously, like I said, there's pockets that are lower and higher. Some of the suburban pockets on the coast are definitely a lot higher. But in general, I'd say it's pretty low. So the wolf situation, I wasn't going to get into this early, but we're already talking about winters and deer population. So I might as well kind of talk about that quick, and we'll jump back to the frigid forage side. But so you're on, sounds like right on the Mississippi River. Are there wolves down in the getting that close to the river and like?
Oh yeah,
there is. Okay.
Yeah, and Minnesota has the most wolves of the lower 48. The only other state that has more wolves than Minnesota is Alaska.
Oh, really?
So
didn't know that.
Yeah, so we have, and again, the numbers game that they, for the last time that they actually had a wolf hunt was like 2014, when we just had a very short one before the courts blocked it again. And back then they were saying we had 2,500 wolves. Here we are, 10 plus years later, and they still try to tell us that that's about what we have. Maybe a little bit more. Some say like maybe 2,800, 2,900 wolves, which is pretty hard to, believe.
Do you see them
what's happened
often?
Not often, but yes, you do see them. I'll see them right out my picture window of my house. You'll see them once in a while. You'll see, if you see a deer scoot by, it can be, a minute later.
Yeah.
Here comes a wolf, behind it. You see more tracks though.
Yeah.
And things than you actually see. But it's not uncommon to talk to, and I talk to a lot of deer hunters, of course, in the business that I'm in. But now these deer camps that are generational deer camps in northern Minnesota, that now they see more wolves and more wolf tracks than they see deer.
That's crazy. So they're obviously cover a big area, right? The wolves, when they hunt, they're not like going to stay in 1,000 acres. They Is that correct? I mean, that was my understanding. I mean, I haven't really paid attention to wolf biology in a while, but don't they cover like big areas and make like big kind of routes when they hunt?
Yeah, well, they'll, if they move into an area, from my understanding, I mean, they'll chase the deer out of the area.
Okay.
So then they got to follow, but I mean, if the wolves move in, and maybe kill a few deer, those deer are going to leave, the ones that are left. So then they'll follow them. And we had a lot of wolves down in north central Minnesota, where I had my hunting lodge, and in that big wildlife management area, there were a lot of wolves in there. And that was it was kind of a scenario to where we would, if we planted a lot of food plots, especially early on, people didn't do that, and there's not a lot of agriculture there. It's kind of in that transition area. You get a little bit south of us, you get a little bit more into ag.
Okay.
But and then where we were, north, it was pretty much.
Yep.
And you'd bring the deer in, but eventually you would bring the wolves in behind them, and then you'd find a couple kills and then there'd be nothing left. The deer would be gone, and it would take a while for them to start to filter back in.
How long do you think that takes? Is it like weeks, days, a month? Like I'm curious. Like wolves come in, they move in the area, they kill a couple, you see tracks and maybe see one or get pictures of them, and for, a period of time, like how long until it normalizes again and they continue on?
Yeah, that I can't say for sure. And I would think it's probably somewhat dependent on the time of the year and food sources and things like that, that if they, if it's winter time and, you have the food there, they might come back a little sooner.
Yeah.
But that's tough to say.
I mean, is it something you think could ruin a season on like a property?
Oh yeah. We've had it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We've had where 2 weeks before the season, you get lots of pictures, nice bucks and, just a lot of deer in general. And we had a lot more deer down there because it was a little milder climate. And then all of a sudden, boom, you find a couple wolf kills and it just blew the whole season.
That's frustrating for sure.
Yeah. So, but you would see them. I mean, it was, I was going to tell you a quick story. My son was bear baiting when he was only like 13, and he was in the management area, and he had just, gone out to put his bait out, and he was on his way back to the house. And all of a sudden he just hears a bunch of running behind him. So he steps behind a tree, and a whole pack of wolves ran by him, and he was hunkered up behind a tree. And he said the very last one stopped, turned, looked at him, and then turned and followed the rest of them off. He's standing there with a 5-gallon bucket in his hand.
Did you get them on your baits pretty often? On bear baits?
The wolves?
Or? Yeah.
No. He just happened to be in the woods and cross paths with them. Gotcha. He was on his way back. Because, what you put out for the bear, is usually sweets and, things like that. So.
Our coyotes eat our bear baits here.
Yeah,
which is interesting.
They'll eat apples.
Really?
They'll eat anything.
Yeah, 100%. Well, actually, the thing I learned this year when I realized, all of a sudden we had a bunch of bear. We killed a bear or two off this particular bait. Actually, we killed 2 off it, but I think it was after. Yeah. We had a bunch of coyotes, constant coyotes in the camp. I'm like, what is going on here? Then there was one picture at night, and there was all these little eyes on the ground. And it must have been like mice or whatever. I mean, there must have been 10 or 20 mice or whatever rodents on the bait eating whatever grain, that was there. And I'm like, oh, maybe that's why those coyotes are here all the time. They're after the mice. So that was something I learned. But I have seen them in the barrel eating it too, the coyotes.
Yeah, so, we get stuff like coons and things like that going after them. And
So you can't hunt them or at all?
No. For wolves?
Yeah.
No, they've tried. It's just it gets batted back and forth. It's a pretty sore subject with, most people in Minnesota. And I just read 2 days ago, they introduced some more legislation to delist them. It's frustrating because, the DNR does their job and, and they've proven that they've recovered. I think the recovery was back like 1,800 or 1,900 wolves would be considered, recovered, and then they could come off the endangered species list. And there's always, some judge, somewhere in Ohio, or I think the latest one was in California, can block it and and all that work and all that, study, and they just kick it back, put it back on the list. And it's some judge who, probably wouldn't know a wolf if it bit him in the ass, and has no clue, but that they have the ability to affect us that live up in there every day. And so what this latest legislation, and it was somebody from Colorado and a legislator from Colorado and one from Wisconsin, and they're trying to introduce this legislation that can't happen anymore. Gotcha. And what they did, they'll say, okay, they might be recovered in Minnesota, might be recovered in Wisconsin, Michigan, but they're not recovered, in Ohio. So boom, you don't get it.
I just saw the other day there was it was in Minnesota. There was a 21-year-old kid who was coyote hunting, and he got arrested and charged because he shot a gray wolf.
You think some of that happens, John? People are shooting them and not saying anything to anybody.
And the interesting part too is in 2023 they set a record for federal trappers trapped 250 wolves. Jeez. Nuisance wolves. So it kind of shows you that their numbers are out. And then you think about what the government. I've never seen what it costs per wolf. What we're spending to do that. Right. When in turn they could actually make money off of it by having a wolf season. Yeah. And I mean the tags when they did it back, in 2013, 14, I mean they sell out instantly.
How many tags did they allocate for that hunt? Do you know?
Wasn't that many. I mean in comparison to nothing near what the trap. I think it maybe been 100. That I guess that I don't know.
So super limited.
And shooting a wolf is much harder than trapping a wolf. Most wolves are taken, in Canada and things too. They're taken, by trapping, not shooting.
Yeah. Do you know if those tags they gave out, did they spread them around with their zones, or did they just give a number and say that was good enough?
Yeah. No, they spread them out.
Interesting.
Yeah. When we went elk hunting this year in Montana, they don't even have that many wolves there, and they sell unlimited tags over the counter.
I know in Idaho you can shoot them. I think
and they don't have.
They're making a lot of money off elk tags, so
I think their wolves probably number in the hundreds.
Yeah. And then I think Colorado has them now, right? They reintroduced them.
Yeah, without telling the ranchers, and that they just saw something on that too.
Crazy. I'm glad we don't have them. We don't have wolves and we don't have big cats. We got coyotes who harass them.
You don't have to go too far to find them.
I've got coyotes, but they don't really. I don't think they put a huge dent in them. They'll kill, fawns and, old deer. They're struggling over the winter, but I mean, I'd say it's pretty rare. People will probably disagree and say, well, no, there's anecdotal stuff that we can say, but I think in general they don't really kill very many healthy, adult deer.
I think they get a lot of fawns.
Yeah, fawns, and like I said, just weak or struggling deer, sick deer. Bobcats kill fawns. We have that. I mean, I've found them for sure. Bobcat kills, but I would say the predation on like mature deer in general is pretty low, which is good. Like I said, I'm glad we don't have to deal with that. We have to deal with enough, so that's a tough environment there. So I guess we can jump back onto the food plot stuff. So you bought the business in what year did you say that was?
2008.
2008. Gotcha.
So I think I started with Midwest Whitetail in 2009.
Oh, it was right away. Okay.
Yeah.
I gotcha. How did you make the connection with Bill?
Actually, at the there was back then they had the state shows.
Yeah.
So I had started with some of the guys, Tim Filowich and the different ones that were the Minnesota guys, and then they introduced me to them at the ATA show.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
And that's
state shows.
That's how that's.
Yeah. I think they've consolidated now to I don't know how many shows they even have.
Yeah. And even back, they kind of went regional because the states were tough to get enough, content, footage and, out of, and, and you got states like Minnesota and most of the big, we have a lot of deer, but most of them are the big deer of southern Minnesota, down in farm country.
Is that
and close
so?
To the Iowa
I know
border.
that southeast Minnesota is pretty good, right, along the Mississippi. Is that kind of one of the better areas? Would you say in the state, or is there other areas that rival that?
Yeah, the trouble with I think any where in southern, Minnesota is going to be better because they have pretty mild winters down there.
Yeah.
And not much snow. If it does snow, it melts again. The trouble with the eastern side is the little more CWD down there.
Okay.
Being bordering Wisconsin, but it definitely is big deer country.
Yep. Yeah, that bluff country stuff along the, we were there on the Wisconsin side or the northeast
Buffalo County and
northeast Iowa, and then southeast Minnesota. It looks like some cool stuff. I don't think I've been through that area before, but it looks pretty cool. So what was the seed offering back in when you started, I guess? Because I know you haven't, I think people try to like reinvent the wheel and like come up with all these blends that are very similar. And I think you've done a good job of sticking with staples that work and that make sense. Obviously you've changed some things and, improved upon it, but I feel like some of these companies are just, they make up these crazy names. This is suited for, it's like it's the same seed as any other blend, but they call it something else.
There is a finite number of seeds out there.
Right.
But there are different varieties, different and quality and things of the same. An alfalfa seed is not an alfalfa. There's so many different varieties, and that's what we constantly kind of tweaking stuff, trying out new things. But we try to keep the different blends basically the same. We'll tweak certain parts of them, but we don't reinvent the wheel. And if there's something, like the plot screen, that we came out with, if there's a need, and then we did the plow down clover mix, for doing that. But as far as, we don't just, take the same seeds and remix them and give them another name, And what we do more so now even is we, encourage, and you're one of the, you do a lot of that, using different blends on the same plot, kind of customizing your stuff by using, the different blends, which we found, we do packages and, things like that now. So that works out really well, planting, pure trophy clover with big and beastie and, and some of those types of, that we encourage, and we're always mixing up with that stuff too,
I think in general, guys that are into it understand, but there's I think a general lack of understanding of like the seeds and how they work together on a property. So the easier we can make it for people, the better. But even like, I know we talked a lot and I've done it as, plant big and beastie with a trophy clover in the fall. And that trophy clover is not going to do a whole lot that fall. The big and beastie is going to take the bulk of the browse pressure, but then in the spring, when that big and beastie is not going to come back because it's a fall annual, that clover has been establishing its root system the whole time, and it's going to explode in the spring. So you've done one planting, but you have a fall plot and then a really good perennial plot that can potentially last you for several years if conditions are right. So so like the big and beastie is I think is your most popular, like the most famous one that everybody hears about, and honestly, there's good reason for it. It's great. Was that one of the original ones that you had, like that blend, or like when did that start?
Yeah, the name is. We've changed it quite a bit, and some of the other, but if you look back at what the original blend was compared to what we have now, and there's more stuff of, there's better rapes and hybrids and stuff that are available now that weren't available back then.
Right.
So we're always looking and changing, but the name is the same, and the integrity of the mix is still always going to be, the same.
Yeah, it's going to serve the same purpose and function the same way. It just will do it better now than it did because you guys have just tweaked it and improved it, which makes sense.
Yeah. And there's a lot of, like I say, there's better varieties out there, more, drought resistant, and things that you can get now that like I say, weren't available back then.
Yeah.
Is a lot of those changes, is that stuff that you guys are figuring out on your own, or are you kind of always getting feedback on people in different climates and things like that to make it better?
Yeah. Yep. Little bit of both, I have probably some of the worst, food plot, we're sandy, we go through, droughts every summer, low fertility, things. So, but then that's also where the pro staff came in, and that was again back in the Midwest whitetail days. That was really nice because we were spread across the country, so we could gather a lot of information.
Yeah.
And now too, I pick my customers' brains when they call me, and we talk, and when do you plant, and and how do you plant, and and we so that way if I get a call, and from somebody else from Pennsylvania or North Carolina or whatever, that I can I can answer their questions and try to point them in the right direction if they're having any issues at all, or if they're just getting started and that. So
I always like to ask this and pick people's brains. Say you have a 100 acre, well, whatever, it doesn't matter, 40 to 100, 200 acre property, probably average, medium size for most people that have a property. They probably have something, in that 30 to 100 and maybe up to 200. Once you get past that, that's probably a bigger one for most areas of the country. What would you, what kind of food plot program would you recommend? I know it depends on probably deer density and a lot of stuff in agriculture, but say it's a standard deer density, standards, average, we'll say. Standard doesn't make any sense. Average deer density. So maybe 20 to 25 deer per square mile or something in that vicinity. And it's maybe a, mixed ag setting with, we'll say, 70% timber, 30% open, maybe between pasture and grass, CRP and ag. What would you say, what would you do for food plots? Total acreage and then breakdown of, each blend and perennials, annuals and that stuff. What would and I know that's a kind of there's a million variables in that question, but just think of a general, average scenario.
And I do get that question. People call that, not as much as say 10 years ago even, or somewhere people go, I've never planted a food plot before, but I want to start. Now, you don't run into too many people that haven't, but you do get people that buy a new piece of property and now they want to get started. Usually I encourage people, well, one, don't bite off more than they can chew. What do you have for equipment? What's your experience level? You're better off, I always said, you're better off doing 2 acres properly and correct than you are trying to put in 5 or 6 acres, and to realize what they're up against. And then they can always, expand after that. Typically what I'll say is I'll say 1/3 perennials, 2/3 annuals, and then you can start tweaking it from there, depending again on deer density and things from there. So, because, if you don't have a high deer density, it doesn't make a lot of sense to plant a lot of clovers, and alfalfas and things, and then have to be out there just mowing them down, if they're not being utilized. If you're doing it as a food source, if you're doing it as a cover crop and rotational, a little bit different, And then from there, again, kind of dependent if it's heavier soil, somewhat shaded, you're leaning heavier on the clovers. If it's open, sandy, kind of like us, where we're at up there, that's where the alfalfas and the chicories, along with the clovers come in as far as the perennial sides go. Annuals, I always push big and beastie right away too, just because it's a late season planting. You have less to worry about as far as the summer, droughts and things, and and then there's other, things like autumn quick plots, stuff like that they can do, and then use that, keep track, encourage people to use journals and write stuff down, because you think you're going to remember, but then you come around next year and you kind of look and go, write down how much fertilizer you used and what you used for fertilizer. What date did you plant? When did the first rain come? Because all those things, make a big difference, as you know.
That's a good
And
call.
the next year you could do exactly the same thing and have totally different results than what you did the first year.
Yep.
But that's usually where I start. And
Yeah.
so depending on, if they have a tractor and, and tillage equipment and things like that, and they could probably do, but even, one thing that people are shocked about is the cost of fertilizer, and when you start talking to them on the phone and they want to plant 6 acres of big and beastie, and then you tell them what, how much money they're going to be spending on fertilizer, well, maybe I'll just do 2 acres to start out with, and you kind of go, that makes more sense. Do do 2 acres properly. Don't do 6 acres and put 2 acres worth of fertilizer onto 6 acres.
Generally, how many units of nitrogen do you recommend per acre of on like a big and beastie planting? And I know it depends on your soil test, but in general, nitrogen's probably the thing that comes and goes and the most volatile in the soil. So
yeah, and we do, and most people do soil tests now, or I shouldn't say most people, but when I first got started, I couldn't even. Most people didn't even want to fertilize. If they were struggling with a plot, and then you ask them, how much fertilizer did you use, and gets quiet, and all of a sudden they go, I didn't know I had to fertilize, and then so now, like say everybody does, but again, we really try to get people to base it off their soil tests, but typically, we're still in that, as far as like poundage goes, with big and beastie, that 200-300 pounds, of a starter fertilizer, but as far as, if you're just doing nitrogen, probably don't want to do more than, as a starter, somewhere in that 50 pounds an acre, otherwise you can risk. And we found too that, just like people underestimate the size of their plots, they think they're doing an acre, but if they actually measure it out, it might be more like a half acre.
Yeah, I see that all
and
the
then
time.
then they put too much seed on there, but the same can happen with urea. I've had people burn their big and beastie plots, come August by putting too much urea on, and then they kill everything, Not a lot, but I have had people, so when I do it, I make sure you step off your plots or use a, a program or something that you can measure and get a good, accurate size of your plots.
For the big and beastie blend, so we've actually had really good luck early season hunting over it. It's been attractive. I can think of at least 2 bucks we've killed in September or early October. I know it's like kind of geared when people think about it to late season, but man, it can be really good early. But it seems, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but it seems like the earlier you plant, maybe the more the plot is suited for late season. The later you plant, it may be more attractive early. Does that make sense? As far as like tonnage goes, I think the earlier you plant in general, there's going to be more time for it to, put on a lot of tonnage. But then if the plants get obviously a little bit mature, then it's not maybe attractive. But I think the point with late season is there's so little food sources that even if it is mature, it's still probably going to be one of the premier food sources in the area just because there's nothing left on the table, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. If you plant it early, and there's other issues that come with it, by planting it too early, because it'll usually burn through the fertilizer that you've, unless you happen to have really good soil. But yeah, if it gets kind of big and gnarly, and starts to tip over, and you got turnips the size of volleyballs and things, it's usually not going to be that attractive early on.
Right.
But I do get people that want something to carry them through the winter. They're done. They don't want it necessarily, to hunt over, but that'll carry them through, like say this time of year. And, so I can tell them to, plant if they have areas that they can plant at different times of the year, those are good ones. And you can plant in different areas too, if you don't plan to hunt over it. But yeah, definitely, like where we're at in Minnesota, they go after it the minute it's coming out of the ground, so they like it when it's young and fresh, and because we don't have a lot of ag around. But yeah, you're right there. Like then the later planting, if it's more attraction than tonnage, that, and that's also true where our autumn quick plot comes in, because it has, some of the same brassicas that the big and beastie has in it, and some turnip, and radish and rape, but it also has some small grains, and things. Yep. So that one there too is geared more towards attraction when everything else is dried up or dying, right. But yeah, we the thought that they don't eat brassicas until it freezes is kind of an old wives' tale. That's not true at all.
No, I've seen them. Yeah, well, like I said, our deer I mean, I think sometimes a big and beastly plot can be the most attractive early season food source there is. But, I can't tell you when or why that is, but I've seen them kind of walk past everything to get to it. When would you say the ideal planting date is for like a middle date in the north for that? I have my date in mind where I think it's kind of – but what would you recommend? Because you see guys that are like trying to plant in like, June, and I'm like, I think that's way too early. I did that this year, but I had a very unique situation, which we can talk about with the interseeding, which is just a different deal. But I don't. When would you recommend that planting be in like the northern states, I guess?
And rainfall is so that first rain is the most important. And I always, I've always preached that. Kind of have your plots ready to go by the end of July. And keep an eye on the weather. But like where I'm at, late July is the best, because we have such a short growing season up there.
Yep.
But you can plant, even in, and it gets so weather dependent the later you get up where we're at. But usually, I always said that first week of August. That was always a pretty good, everything being equal, and then the farther south you go, you can get, into more middle of August and things, but usually through the north, last week of July, first week of August, be ready to go, have your seed, have your fertilizer, ready to go so you can rock and roll when you see that storm coming.
Well, I think that's exact. I start to look at like mid-July in the forecast, and it's like, man, if we're going to have a good stretch of wet, I may just plant, July 20th or something like that. A lot of times, though, the problem, I rather have it in a little early, and I'm not talking June, but I'm talking, July 15th, July 25th, something like that, than risk planting or not planting because you don't get any rain from July 25th to August 20th, and now you're planting August 25th, which can still be a successful plot, but you're just not going to get the tonnage if you have that, a month less of growing, which could be all right in some situations. So I'm always like kind of erring on the early side to be safe if we can. Seems like we just get these late summer droughts. Not every year, but it seems like more often than not, we're like trying to catch these rains, and it gets tough.
This summer here or last summer, I should say, was weird. We had I don't know how many days of 90 we had, but it was, for here, it seemed like it was hotter than I can remember in the last 5 years. I'd have to look at the actual dates, but it was something like in a 30-day span, the number of 90-degree days, it seemed like almost every single day. For that month span at the end of July and into August right there.
We had because I remember.
And it didn't rain.
That's what I'm saying. I remember that. We had a long span of no rain. So it just seems like you can't count on anything anymore when it comes to rain or weather. Like you just have no idea. So if you have an opportunity to get something in with ideal conditions, like I'm going to capitalize. Maybe it wasn't exactly what I was thinking, or, it's like I'd rather have something green growing in the plot than dirt come, October. So I'm trying to like capitalize. So I think I've become a lot more looser with my planning dates and, I guess planning methods now, because I'm like, if we can get it in and everything looks good, you might as well capitalize because you never know what's coming, And
it depends on the conditions when that, because say you got rain coming, but if the soil is dry and you have no subsoil moisture in there, I say sometimes it's better to plant after a good rain than risk planting, because if you don't have any moisture, if it's powder dry and you get out there and seed because you see some rain coming, you got some storm clouds coming, but you only get a tenth or a quarter inch of rain, and it makes that seed pop. And then for the next 5 days, it's 90 degrees again. It's gone. But if you have moisture in the soil, if you had a good rain and then you got another, and sometimes big and beast, if you get out and plant after, it'll pop, even after, when you seed on top and pack it down into that wet soil, it'll pop and go. So it's everything's a little bit different. It's always a risk, But that's the part that we run into a lot, is because it's dry in the summer, and then but so there's no moisture, and if you get out there, like say, and it's tempting, when you see a storm coming, but I've watched them too just fall apart, on the radar right before they get to you, or you get just a little bit. So that is, but yeah, I'm the same way. When there's rain coming, and if it looks like a good one, it's hard not to plant.
Yeah.
Really, the last couple summers, same thing, but those Canadian wildfires have actually, the haze and stuff that they've had have actually kind of protected us, where
From
like
heat.
Minneapolis was in the 90s every day. We were still in the upper 70s,
Yeah.
but the minute you'd get a clear day, we'd be just as hot,
Blazing hot.
so.
As far as perennials go, whether it's whatever perennial mix you decide, trophy clover or what's the one with alfalfa in it? Is it
The wall hanger is
Wall hanger,
alfalfa, chicory,
Yep.
clover. That's geared more towards the sandier,
Yep.
a soil,
Yep.
full sun, and then the wild game buffet is more clover based. Still has a little bit of alfalfa in it, but it's primarily clover based. And then both of those have a 15% cover crop of radish, turnip, and rape.
Okay.
That works as a nurse crop,
Yep.
for that first season.
I'm a big believer that if you had one food plot to plant, and you could only plant one, and your first food plot that you establish is a perennial plot, whether it's alfalfa or clover. I haven't had a lot of luck with chicory. I know some people have, but so for me, it's usually alfalfa or clover. It's usually trophy clover, your trophy clover blend, honestly. But I think having that like staple year, because it's not year round, but clover can go well into the winter if you don't have deep snow and hard freezes. I mean, I've had deer digging through snow to get clover next to like beans or whatever else. So they still favor it pretty heavily into like the late season if it's available. But then, of course, it's the first thing, early April that's greening up. And I think that's so important to have that food source, on your property. I think it just becomes a staple, and it's like holds deer there to an extent. And I don't think you need that much of it. I think if you have an acre of that, I mean, unless your deer density is like sky high, it's tough for them to eat down an acre of productive, well-managed like perennial.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I go back to that 1/3, 2/3,
Yeah.
and then tweak it. And
Yeah.
again, it depends on, if you're planting 20 acres, you still probably don't need a third, of that. But, like say, and clover, because it's one of the first things to green up, and then if you're a turkey hunter and that, but it's crucial up where we're at, something after a long winter, when their ribs are showing, if they've had a tough winter, that clover is really hard to beat.
Yeah, if someone could plant one plot in that, half acre to acre size, would you recommend a perennial like that, would you say? Or what would your breakdown be?
Yeah, I mean, if you just had a half acre to work with, I mean, planting an annual in there, I mean, I guess it depends on what your goals are too. If you're just planting it to shoot something over and then, and then that's it, you're not worried about, the rest of the year, then an annual. But even if you have any deer density at all, even a half acre, big and beastie, can get wiped out pretty fast. And when it's gone, it's gone. So that's the nice thing about clover. And yeah, I would have to say if you're only going to do one thing, clover is pretty hard to beat.
Yeah, I would agree.
And you can mix it up a little bit. That's where like the wild game buffet and stuff like that, and putting a little bit of few annuals with it and stuff can help increase tonnage and lengthen out that time that it's attractive, but then still be there to green up in the spring, provide all those benefits.
Yeah. Because I get questions a lot about, and it's mostly guys that haven't really planted food plots before, and they have a small plot, in that half acre, maybe a quarter acre. I think the smaller you get, the more you heavily favor those, like clovers, I would say. The smaller you get,
it's really
But what other advice would you give to someone that maybe is like, hey, I just want to plant, maybe it's an old log landing or a road, or maybe they just have a back section of a field and they just don't have a lot. What do you think is, what advice would you give to them, I guess, if they're like trying to plant their first food plot? They're not real experienced. Maybe they have limited equipment, maybe some. I think most people can, unless you're in a location you can't get equipment too, but I think most people can like borrow or get some level of equipment to plant a plot if they have to. But that's the other reason I guess I'll before I answer, I favor those clovers because you really don't have to replant them if you maintain them. So it's like, hey, I got to borrow a tractor to do some tillage or whatever. Maybe it's a ATV with one of those discs on the back, whatever it is, rototiller. They can get it there, get it done, plant it, and then potentially that plot is going to have some longevity to it, and they're not able to go back in. That may make more sense for them as well. So that's another reason I kind of recommend that. But what would your advice be, or some pointers for people that are just starting and they only have one smallish plot to plant?
Yeah, and you can actually do a lot with a backpack sprayer, you know, and a seeder. I mean, without tilling, especially like roads and things. And if you're ever in like logging roads and those small little honey holes, they're usually going to be a low light situation. Yep. And clover is really your only option when it comes to that, you know. But yeah, you don't even have to, especially if you got like a lot of rocky soil. I mean, some of the videos I see from you guys, some of the rocks and stuff that you have, you know, I mean, you know, that's tough on any equipment and things. But if you can eliminate the vegetation that's there, you know, and you don't even have to burn it. You don't have to, you know, mow it, you know, depending if it's 4 feet tall or something, you know, it's still nice to knock it down. But if you can kill the existing vegetation and seed the clover and some fertilizer and some lime, or if, you know, need to, you can grow a pretty nice plot, you know, in those types of situations. You know, so, and logging trails, I mean, people are surprised at how fast that can add up. You know, what a 12-foot wide, you know, half-mile trail. Right. You know, I mean, you can get a lot of, you know, if it's completely choked off, it's hard to grow even clover in there. But if you get any sunlight in it all, and you can tell a lot of times you'll be walking along a trail and all of a sudden it gets thin and there's just a lot of dirt showing, and you look up, and it's because it's completely canopied over, you know, and then you get the areas where it might open up. So anything you can do, you know, tipping a few trees over to let a little more sunlight in, you know, but yeah, you can do a lot with zero. And that's where those, you know, the term is used, but, you know, back in the Midwest whitetail days, you know, kind of that poor man plot, you know, is where that came in. You know, and we did that, and I know, like Bill always liked to burn his, and I would tell people, you know, that's not necessary. You know, you don't have to burn the dead vegetation, and sometimes it's better not to because it acts like a mulch. You know, and if you can just leave it standing, it'll eventually fall over, or just knock it down, roll it after you've seeded. You know, if you can drive your ATV around on it or something and just knock it down, that clover is going to grow right up through there.
That's what I've found too. Is like when I am. And, you know, I have equipment on, you know, I've done it not every way, but a lot of different ways. And I actually think that leaving whatever is growing there when you seed is better because it can get down through everything to the ground better, and then knock it over, spray it, whatever, and let it sit on top. That's a better option than trying to knock it all down and then try to get your seed down through this thatch layer, which doesn't always work. When it's standing and it's vertical, the seed can get down through. When it's laying down as a mulch and it's sitting on top, you're not going to have a very high germination rate. So I've had better luck like seeding, even when it's green sometimes, then spraying, potentially rolling it, knocking down, driving over, whatever, and then had pretty good stands like that. Yeah. And, I
mean, you could do that with, you know, any small seeds, you know, you know, big and beastie, do that a lot too. We've done where, you know, and there's, you know, I'm a big believer in no-till, but I'm not a big believer in throw and grow. You know, those are some of the terms that used to come out, and people would ask you, what do you have for a throw and grow? And I'm like, hey, we don't have one, you know.
Well, that's kind of my point with these seed blends. It's like throw and grow. What is throw? It's not really throw and grow. It's like, it's ryegrass is what it is.
Yeah,
or exactly. Like in some other stuff that's just the same as the other blends that we're planting, that they're not really throw and grow. I mean, like I said, you have to do some preparation. You can't just go out there and, like in a closed canopy forest, and just broadcast seed on the leaves and expect something to happen. It's not gonna.
Yeah, or they say, you know, rake an area, you know, and put the seed down, and you know, and I mean, you know, they got a 15 or 20 square foot area that they put, you know, that's not gonna, you know, and again, ryegrass is probably the main ingredient in there. and but it's never, yeah, you kind of get what you put into it. But yeah, so anyway, I've always been a big believer, and because probably the most questions that I get and the problems that people have are weed control, and no matter what they plant, when they plant it, and those are the things that can happen. If you go back to like you were talking about planting big and beastie too early, people that want to put it in June because they put it in at the end of July and it got, this big. Well, I'm going to put it in 2 weeks or 4 weeks earlier and it's going to get that much bigger. But that isn't how it works, but you also open the window to a lot more problems, including weeds, and so by planting later and, addressing the weeds, and then there's a lot of weeds that don't germinate later in August either. So you have less weed competition. And then, clovers, things like that, you're always going to, at eventually, those grasses, they don't give up, so they keep coming. So there's a lot of, and there's some herbicides out there now that, that like clethodim and stuff that you can use that are available to, just the average food plotter now that so you can kind of keep those clover plots going forever. If that's what you choose to do.
Really, the maintenance on a clover plot is like, I think it's pretty minimal. Like my program is like maybe some potash in like April, or May, if it needs it with a soil test, and then it's like just see if there's much in it. If it's broadleaf, I usually just mow it pretty low, and then the clovers does a pretty good job of taking over and outcompeting the broadleaf. If there's grass, spray it with cleth, and you're pretty much good. You could maintain a clover plot for a year in like potentially like a couple hours. You know what I mean with stuff. The one thing I'll say about the grasses and the clover, you really want to get that stuff when those grasses are young in the spring, like May time frame, maybe June, because they get tougher and tougher to kill out. And it's that class is less effective and takes way. That's the other thing. It takes a while for it to work. So you may think nothing's happening, but it may take 3 weeks for that grass to die out. But I know if you want to maintain that plot, I'd get on it earlier rather than later. I would say in the spring.
And mowing definitely. That's why second and third crop alfalfa is always valuable, more expensive than first crop alfalfa or, because that'll take down, most of the weeds to the point. And if you do have a grass problem, then either like early in the spring like that, you want to get them, when they're actively growing. And then the clethodim, and usually you can tell they'll stay green, but you'll kind of notice that maybe the grasses inside the plot have stopped growing or getting any taller where the grass outside the plots. And then when it does die, it actually dies then pretty fast. But it might take, like you said, 2 to 3 weeks for that to happen. But if you try to do it in the middle of summer, it's just like spraying Roundup in your driveway or something like that. When you're out there in the spring and you spray some weeds in your yard, you walk out the next morning, they're already wilted, and tipping over. You do that in July on a hot sunny day, and it could be a week, and you go out, wonder, what did I do wrong? What happened? How come? Yes, because they're just hanging on too. And then fall is another really good time to spray for weeds, because after that first cold spell, they're sucking in everything to kind of get ready for winter. So if you hit them with a herbicide at that time of year too, that's a really effective, and especially if you have intentions of, say, frost seeding or something come spring, that's an ideal time to spray it in the fall and then be ready to, in the spring. And if you're only going to fertilize your perennial fields once a year, fall is actually the best time to do it. And the same reason there is that those clovers, they're going to take in those nutrients and so it's going to help them stay greener in the fall. It's going to help them winter over better, survive the winter, and then get started quicker in the spring.
That makes sense.
So
I guess I could shift my fertilizer to fall. What time you say fall? Like September, October? What's the time frame?
Anytime in September. Even early October. again, depends on, what the weather's doing,
Yeah.
rainfall,
I'm always
and,
paranoid to
and
go in and do that stuff that time of year because it's like the season are just about to be the season. That's why I favor the spring, even if it's not as effective.
yeah,
But
yeah, it's really
yeah.
not in your, you're not in that mindset,
Well,
in the
yeah.
fall to be working on your plots too much,
The other thing, like it's the same scenario, is a lot of these trees you want to eliminate. Particularly for us, it's beech. We had still have a lot of it that just you have sometimes it can take over like a patch, and it's just not really. It's good like visual screen, the low beech brush we'll call it, but like it's just not very good habitat. But the problem is you cut down a beech tree and it throws up 1,000 suckers. They come up all around it, so it's like you're better off not doing that, cutting it. You're better off to like hack and squirt it, but that only really works in the fall when it's drawing everything back down in the root system. So I don't want to be going through my timber in like the middle of September or late September doing that. So I never end up doing anything about these beaches. I just leave them alone because I'm like, well, I'm not going to do it now. I can't. That's just not a compromise I'm willing to make. So.
How often are you running soil tests? Like twice a year, once in the spring, once in the
once a year is what I usually do.
Yeah.
I mean, if I have a good perennial plot, sometimes I'll stretch it a couple years. But like I said, it's probably because I had a pretty good soil test the year that I did, and I feel pretty confident it'll be okay for, a couple of years on a perennial plot. But I mean, any new plot that I'm going to plant, or I'm going to plant something different, I'm absolutely doing one. And then anytime you're changing, I mean, or you're going from one planting like an annual to a perennial or vice versa, I'm always going to do a soil test. I'm going to do one anyway for pretty much all my plots. I think that's I don't know. I don't know why people don't. If they're going to go through all the effort and spend the money to plant a food plot, why not spend $15 or $20 to make sure it's going to be successful? Like I said, I know it takes some planning, but not that much. It's like get a kit or get even like just a bag and then go out there and do it when you're hanging cameras or scouting or whatever, and then send it in. And it's not like you got to do it right before you plant either. You can do it well ahead of time. So
and you don't have to do it every year. I mean, you can do it every few years, and especially if you're trying to bring your pH up or something like that. That's not going to be an overnight thing anyways. But if you do it every couple years, that's a good time. And I always tell my customers it's less than a bag of fertilizer. So it's money well spent.
It absolutely is. Mm-hmm. What kind of pHs are you dealing with where you're at? Are they low, high?
Pretty poor. We're in that 5.5. And we're usually less than 6.
Being that it's sandy soil, is it easier to bring up than like a clay or heavy loam? I guess quicker.
A little bit, but it doesn't last as long either because sand, it washes everything through.
Yeah.
So so I use a lot of Pell lime, and I usually apply some every year, just get into a routine and do that.
Seems like for us, we have to go really heavy in the beginning, and it might take 3 or 4 years, honestly, to get where we want to be, high 6s to 7. But it seems like once we get there, we have they stay there for a while, years. I still test them, but I think you're right. In the beginning, it's really important to do a soil test when you're first establishing a plot. And it's probably important to do it all the time, but that's the most critical if you're going to start.
And just to get a base, and when you find stuff out too, like when I moved up to Bemidji there, and I did my soil test, our phosphorus is off the charts.
Yeah.
I mean, and so you don't want to add any more phosphorus to your, nitrogen and potash. So, and if you don't know that, and you're just buying a 19, and just keep you're just worsening the problem, The only way to get rid of phosphorus is to use it up, by the plant.
That's pretty typical of the New England as well. Pretty high phosphorus as well. So sometimes I won't even. No phosphorus fertilizer. Sometimes it calls for a little bit, but most of the time it's pretty low on that. And like you said, pretty high on potash. Obviously.
And then around the lakes and stuff too, they in the rivers and stuff, they discourage you from using it.
Yeah.
anyways,
Well,
but
yeah, yeah. They definitely don't want more than you need on there. In
yeah,
excess
so
of it, that's for
I
sure.
don't do any, but if you didn't, if I didn't know that,
Right.
I'd just be putting on, because I mean, it's good that people, like say most everybody fertilizes now, but a lot of people still just do the, triple
Triple
19, triple
19, triple
20 or
10,
something like that.
whatever. Yeah, yeah.
And
Which is probably
that's,
better than not doing anything, but they could be getting more out of their money. That's for sure.
Yeah, it gets expensive.
yeah,
Yeah, it does.
If you don't,
It gets real
might
expensive.
as well take the test.
yeah.
Have you done much with? I know that brassicas are a pretty short season, so it's probably not as like prevalent as like a spring planting, like whatever. But have you done much with like slow release nitrogens, like a treated nitrogen, like a Super U or an agrotane? Have you messed much with them?
No, no, I haven't. And for one, we don't really have any available
Okay.
up where we're at up there, but
yeah.
a little bit more where I've seen it down a little more in ag country
Yeah.
and things. Yeah, I mean, all that I think is good, but I personally haven't.
Yeah, I mean it's not available where I'm at, but the farm in New York is an ag country, and it was available, so I've been using it. And then I actually sometimes will buy it out there and bring it back to New Hampshire in the back of my truck because I can't get it. And yeah, it's been, I don't know. I mean, it seems to work, but who knows? It's pretty tough to tell unless you have like a trial next to each other with each kind. The theory makes sense.
The nice part there, I mean, if you get a coat that you don't have to worry about a rainfall,
Yeah.
that's the big benefit, especially because most people don't realize that. And when I tell people that you got about 3 days, and that if you just put it out and you miss that rain, if you don't, if you just top dress it, and you're not, you got about 3 days and it's gone,
I'm so paranoid about that in the summer.
Yeah,
If ever I'm top dressing urea, I'm like just like looking at the weather, and I get it down. I'm like staring at the sky. I'm like, come on.
Oh,
Start raining now. And then like if it doesn't, I'm like sweating. And I'm like, oh. I'm like, and then I wonder how much I lost. It's like if it didn't rain, I'm like, did I lose half? I mean, I can't tell. I'm like, do I need to go do it again? It's just like, it drives me crazy.
I can just picture that.
I've spread a lot of nitrogen in the rain. In the rain, I'm so paranoid till it finally. And I'll be out there with my four-wheeler, trying to do it, and it starts clumping up in the, and I'm putting the bag over the hopper and stuff, trying to get it, and then it's all stuck to the inside, when you get down to the end. But I go, at least I know it's raining.
Yeah, it's a good feeling when you spread it and you get a good soaker within like a couple hours. You're like, perfect, nailed it.
But I've come in on the four-wheeler wet many times, after doing that. But
yeah. So we covered some of that. We talked about the screens, which I think make a lot of sense. Those are super effective. There's a lot of guys that are planting more permanent screens, switchgrass, miscanthus. Some stuff we do is even like pine or conifer planting, and those can be good, but those are tough to establish. They're very costly. They're labor intensive, and then even when you do get them right, it takes sometimes 2 and 3 years for those grass, I guess, related plantings. And then if you're talking a conifer, it could take 10 years for it to be a legitimate screen.
Yeah. And I run into that a lot. And I, encourage people, if they know that that's where they want that screen, that's something they could do that and still do like plot screen for the next, and while they get those other ones established,
do both.
And then eventually, and then they can get that going. Because native grasses are great, but you have to have your ducks in a row if you're going to do that, because the seed is expensive. They're hard to plant. And then the maintenance on them for the first few years, till you get them established, can be tough. So you do have to, where the plot screen generally is pretty dang easy. It's more weather dependent than anything. If you're going to get rain, it's going to, it is a big nutrient user. You got to put some fertilizer on it.
Yeah, you give it enough nitrogen, it'll be happy though. It'll go.
Yeah. Yep. And you can manipulate. You can do different things. You can funnel deer. You can. You can try different things, and then like say even do that until where and then you can go about the business of getting a permanent one.
Yeah, for sure. That's one thing I think I always knew and I've seen it, but this year drove it home is the ability of those tall grass species, whether it's a switchgrass or a plot screen or even just corn, just to really like direct and funnel and pinch deer movement. It's just insane how well that works if you design your plantings correctly. It's just a super effective way of doing things to really like enhance and push deer past the stand location, particularly in bow range. So whether you, like I said, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but that is a really effective thing. That's not really like a food aspect or even potentially like a screening thing, but just as more of like to make deer go where you want them to go.
Yeah. If you make a little path through there, you know, like a foot wide path, and it's funny, they'll wait, you know, if they get spooked, they wait to get on that, you know, one after another, funneling, you know, getting on that, you know, take that little foot wide path, you know, to get through there to the other side is kind of funny. They don't just go busting through the screen in any, you know, a spot. They wait for that opening and they'll sit and wait till one goes, you know, to the next one. So that's kind of funny.
Yeah, that's a whole, like I said, I obviously when you're thinking about planting anything, it's like the food component's like kind of number one. And then you start to think about screening, and that's, I mean, usually it's to prevent the deer seeing and also just people and, you know, just adding a layer of like cover and structure between what could be perceived to be pressure or a road or whatever. So there's a lot of value in that. But like I said, the actual ability to funnel and direct deer is such a big deal that I guess I took it for granted, or I just didn't really put as much value as I should have in the past. So that's been a big one for me that I've kind of realized. What else? I think is there anything else any seed that we didn't cover that's important to talk about when you're talking about trying to develop a property and have a food plot / screen / whatever program?
We could talk a little bit about, you know, just cover crops, you know, spring type crops. That is something, you know, that is important. And if people, especially if they're planting that same ground, you know, year after year after year, you know, they have to take care of it, you know, and it's not, you don't want to be like, you know, sometimes like big ag where it's just corn on corn on corn, you know, and they just keep pouring the nutrient. But by doing, you know, if you're going to do a fall annual, like a big and beastie or whatever, you know, a small grain, it's nice and it's good for your soil, good for weed suppression, you know, keeping that soil healthy is, you know, cover crops. And I know you guys have done, you know, stuff from, you know, buckwheat and, you know, things you can, and there's so many things that you can use and there's really no wrong way to do it. You know, you can use small grains, you know, you can use wheat and rye and we encourage it, you know, like something like our plow down clover.
Yeah.
The reason we did that, one, it's easy to plant, and adds nitrogen back in, you know, good weed suppressor. But the good thing about it is it's still going to remain attractive. So if for some reason you change your mind or something happens, which, you know, or if the conditions are bad that, you know, you're not going to plant big and beastie or you decide to do, now you still have a food plot. And if you know, mow it, take care of it, you're going to have a good food source going in.
I have a question about annual clovers versus perennial clovers. Do those annual clovers actually die after the first year, or do they come back? Because I feel like they come back, and maybe it's just certain species in the blend are coming back as a perennial. But by definition, do annual clovers actually die after that first year and don't come back? Is that like
they should? And some of that might be the seed from if they've flowered out and dropped their seed, you know, and that's how those clovers, you know, reseed themselves.
Right.
Those, you know, is by their seed. So yeah, that can happen. Depends on the severity of the winter too, and what stage, you know, they might have been at. But yeah, you can get definitely get some regrowth. And then like your reds, like your medium and mammoth, they're actually like a biennial clover. So they're like a 2-year lifespan. You know, and then your whites, you know, and some those are the more, you know, your longer lasting, you know, and that's like even with and they take longer to get established, and you know they don't provide the tonnage. That's why with like our pure trophy clover, you know, that blend of 5 of those, you kind of try to get the benefits of what each one brings to the table. But then so like our annuals, which, you know, like say the crimson, that and they grow faster, they can really get established because they do kind of all in that first 1 year,
Yeah, so they're more suited for a cover crop or a late season planting.
Yeah, and they don't frost seed as well,
Yep.
because they don't, that's not quite what they're,
Yep.
So when people want to do that, and again, even if you don't call it a frost seed or you call it a no-till, get out there closer to spring green up, before things have actually started to green up. There's still a lot of moisture in the soil. If it does freeze or get a little snow after that, it's okay. But you don't want to be out there, you could be frost seeding now in February if as long as the ground is snow free or 90% snow free.
No, that makes sense. I guess my thing was, I've planted these, like the plow down clover, and I'm like, still going. It's like a couple. I'm like, this is an annual. I'm like trying to understand. I'm like, what's going on here? But that makes sense if they're biannual and they're, the reseeding. That's probably. But I guess when people are planting an annual clover or an annual clover blend like the plow down, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's only going to last that year and then you're going to have like a dirt field the next year. Like there's a pretty good chance that some of those are going to be there the next spring, I guess is my
sure.
point.
Yeah, but the idea behind that is it does grow quicker because they're not putting the root system down that that the perennial clovers are. And I've had a lot of customers that go, that's the nicest clover field I've ever grown. They don't want to plow it up. They're like, why? They're going to do something like that's the prettiest clover field I've ever had, and so.
Yeah, you could go in with into that field if it did do really well. You could frost seed the trophy clover into it the next spring, and you're probably going to maintain that field now. So that's I did that. I can think of one plot that I did that with, where it started as plow down. And it was the same thing. I was like, I don't want to plow this down. It looks awesome. And I left it. And then I came back the next year, and I'm pretty sure I frost seeded plow down or trophy clover, the perennial, into it. And that thing's actually still going today. So that was several years ago. So yeah.
Yeah, and the longer you leave that clover in, the better. For the soil. If you can leave it in for another season. Like if you don't plow it up that fall and then let her go till the next fall. Maybe beef it up a little bit, take care of it. It's only going to be that much better for the soil, add that much more nitrogen.
Yeah, I think other thing, I think cover crops are great. The other thing that I like about them is they all typically green up pretty early in the spring as well. So they're providing that early, green food source for the deer in April. Late, depending where you are, maybe it's late March or maybe it's early May, if you're far, far north. But that's a really good thing. I think the one thing to keep in mind is you got to think about how you're going to terminate them though, because some of that stuff can get it grows pretty vigorously in the spring.
Yeah.
So you have to have a plan to do that, I guess, whether it's mowing or spraying or tilling. But if you have limited equipment, I guess that becomes more into play is how are we going to manage this going forward. I think anymore, like the more I do this food plot stuff is like, it's thinking ahead. More than anything, it's like, what is this plot going to be this year? If it fails, what's my move? And then next spring, what am I going to do with it? Like just trying to plan ahead and have different different options and plan B and A and like, okay, I'm going to pivot to this because it, like I said, it rarely goes exactly how you think it's going to. One thing we run into in my New York farm, it's always wet in the spring. Well, not always, but often wet, and it's muddy, and I can't really get in there to do much of anything in the spring. And then when it dries up, it's like time to go. So you don't have there's like a short window where you can actually do anything in the spring. That's one thing I've been, and Eric, Hansen always talks about it. He's like, yeah, in theory that'll work, or yeah, that'll work sometimes, or yeah, if everything, like he's always like, yeah, like, and of course he's a farmer, so it's his livelihood and he understands it better than anybody. But it's not always the same formula, and you got to be able to pivot. The good thing about having different blends and different plantings is you kind of have a seed for any, scenario. Like your autumn quick plot, you could plant that, and you could almost get away with like early mid-October if you have like a warm stretch of a week and a rain. Like you could have a plot in 10 days that's drawing deer, and then you have that cover crop for the spring also feeding deer and coming on strong. So there's lots of options I think people don't realize are there, and
and Mother Nature is always in charge. That's the thing, and like kind of what you were saying before, what happens in Minnesota, if we have a really late spring, which
Yeah.
can happen, to where we have snow even up till, end of April.
Yeah.
And then the bad part about that is you get about a week of spring and summers here,
Yeah.
and so yeah, any plans you had for spring plantings and taking advantage of spring rains and things they're out the window,
Right.
and that's why it's nice if you have enough room, that you can have, established clover plots and things like that are always, you always got something.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's always good to have something, and I know you've talked about that on yours. It's always good to have something green and growing
Yeah.
on your plots rather than just sitting fallow. And and I do get the question a lot about diseases and planting brassicas too many years in a row and things. And by doing that and keeping you kind of break that cycle.
Yep.
And by planting other things and you can keep your soil healthier for longer and avoid any of those problems, because that's where those, fungus and stuff, just like old corn stalks and things too. That's where they can live, so you want to get that, those old turnips and those old,
Yeah.
you want to get those kind of chewed up and back in the soil again,
Yeah, I agree. Like I said, I definitely want something always growing on it. The other thing is if you can always have something green, you're not going to have it in like February right now. Like it's going to go dormant or it's going to die off potentially. But if you can always have something green, say, 8 to 10 months a year on all your acres, you're providing a lot of food for the deer, almost year round. And I just think over time, the deer herd recognizes that there's always, a large amount of tonnage and food in this area. And I think it just helps to build the herd and just to build the property over time. So, a lot of people are just worried about killing them over, a plot in the fall, which, I'm worried about that too. But, if you take a year-round approach, I think it can really help to develop a property. Maybe if you're on like a permission piece or a lease that you don't know if you're going to have it, yeah, maybe I wouldn't go crazy about planting all these acres and worry about that as much. But if you're going to invest in a property and you want to develop it over time and you own it, I think that's the way to go.
Yeah. And there's a satisfaction in that too. There's sometimes I think people go into food plotting with the intention that I'm just going to shoot I'm doing this to shoot a big deer. And then they've kind of realized, that one, it is an enjoyable, though often frustrating and, hobby, and expensive, but there's definitely a sense of satisfaction to growing, whether it's, food plots, trees, whatever, all the different things that you might do to improve your property, whether you shoot something over it or not. I think there's definitely, people, there's something to take away from that.
Yeah.
And that's why people do it. I don't know if people would, invest that kind of money in that if all they're after is, to shoot a deer and, be
well,
done.
I think you're right though. A lot of them start because they think they're just going to shoot a deer over it, and then it morphs. That's what happened to me for sure. That's spot on for my scenario. Let's talk a little bit about the interseeding thing, I guess, quick, and then kind of wrap it up. This was a concept. So I like having. I think number one is that staple perennial plot on a property. I think that's my number one. But kind of close to two with the annual green planting is like a grain, having that as well. So I like to have kind of all three. A perennial plot, sometimes you can accomplish them in the same plot, which we're about to talk about. And then a grain, and then like a fall annual green, like whether it's brassicas or cereal grains or something of that nature. So I'm always trying to get all of those in there. I feel like if you have all those options, there's really nothing that the deer are going to be lacking, and there's no reason for them to go elsewhere for food if you have enough acreage of it and your plots are successful. The more I plant, the more I'm starting to favor corn. And so this past year, both in New Hampshire and in New York, I spring planted corn, 30-inch corn, and then on both farms, I went in and it was basically when the corn, I think, was in the V4 to 6 stage, which is usually around late June. at least from when I plant, which is like mid to late May. So it's coinciding with like a nitrogen application in the corn, the herbicide application, and then I'm interseeding. So I'm kind of doing that all at the same time. So I'm in there. Obviously, you don't want to be in. And so I guess to explain a little more, interseeding is essentially seeding, for lack of a better term, a cover crop mix, which is not much different than, what we talked about, like a plow down clover and a big and beastie. And then actually, I think I even put some aspects of autumn quick plot in there as well. But you're going in while the corn has not canopied and you're planting in between those rows. There's actually attachments like an interseeder that will go on the back of a tractor. And I had one lined up that I didn't own it. I was going to rent it, but that fell through. So that kind of was, I ended up walking 12 miles.
Yeah, I remember you
that one day to do that.
I was pretty impressed.
Yeah, it was like, oh man, it was brutal, but whatever. I got it done. And it's not as precise, and it probably didn't work as well as it could have, because you have some seed that are like, laying next to a corn stalk, and then some of them are spaced. But ideally, you want to put that on like 30-inch rows offset from the corn. So, you get the corn row, and then 15 inches you have a row of cover, and then another 15 inches corn stalk, and so it's staggered, and that's the ideal thing. And the idea is that corn or that cover crop will germinate and establish while there's still sunlight hitting the dirt. But then the corn's going to canopy, and it's going to stay canopied for a period of time, and that's going to slow the growth of that cover crop. And then as the corn starts to die down, this is the part that is very variable. If you have a really, corn that stays green long, and you get an early frost, and you have a really high density of corn, that may not work as well, because you may never get that additional sunlight at the end of the growing season that's going to push that interseed mix up. So that's kind of a big variable. Both of my instances, though, I had bears that were in my corn in New Hampshire. So they did a number on it, and they kind of took a bunch of stalks out. But the benefit of that, I'm not happy they did it, but I had that interseed mix underneath that exploded because it had a bunch of sunlight. And it was a good plot because it still had that mix, and it had corn in it. And then in New York, that cornfield was doing really well. And then we had a crazy hailstorm that like 80% defoliated the corn, but it was after the corn had already made ears and filled out. And this was in August. So I had 150 bushel corn, and I had a month and a half of this cover crop interseed mix that I seeded in June that grew, and I had brassicas that were 24 inches tall, and it was like the most insane thing I've ever seen, like the most deer food, and it was a big field. It was 7 acres that this happened in, and it was like, this is crazy how much food is in this field right now. It's like 14 acres of food in a 7-acre field, because it literally was a double crop, and both of them did well. It wasn't like, usually when you plant two things, one of them does better than the other, right? But this was like the perfect scenario where they both did extremely well, and it was just like the tonnage was insane. And I'm sure I'll have, I was looking at pictures tonight from it. There's like almost 3 feet of snow now, but they're just in that. I don't know if they're getting to the green anymore. Probably not. I'm sure they'll get to it first thing in the spring, particularly the annual clovers. But yeah, it was like the best plot I've ever seen, the most attractive. It held so many deer on that property this year. It was a game changer. And I killed the number one buckeyes after my first sit on it in late October. So
yeah, that was well. I watched that because people have been doing that with beans, and we've been doing that since the beginning.
And it may be better suited for beans, honestly, because it probably is in general.
And people would ask me about corn, if you could do the same thing with corn, and I'd usually kind of direct them more towards say maybe areas that were thinner, or maybe flooded out if you had some pockets in the field, and then around the edges where the corn is thinner and shorter because of either browse or just lack of sunlight. Those are all good areas, but I always wondered how it would do in the center of a large cornfield. It was pretty darn impressive.
Well, it did. Like I said, if we hadn't got that hailstorm, though, I'm sure it would have done nearly as well. But I'm curious. The other thing that I've thought about, to try to recreate that is planting 60-inch corn, because that is going to canopy far later in, maybe not even at all. And I think that may be an answer you could count on. So I want to experiment with that. I know there's been some farmers that have done that. And what they were doing is they were interseeding 60-inch corn, and they were, combining their corn, and then they were grazing cattle in there after they combined their corn. So they wanted that feed, that green feed in the fall for their cattle. And so they're kind of dual purposing that acreage, and they say it's good for the soil. So that's something that I was thinking about trying on half of that field this year, is trying to do 60-inch corn and then see how that does. I don't know. You kind of have to experiment with it. And it's not going to be the same every year. Like, we were saying, there's going to be different deals. Obviously, I guess the downfall is, like, you can't really spray after you interseed, right? So that's got to be, it's got to be after your final herbicide, or maybe your only, which I try to minimize spraying if I can. So I'm going to try to get away with as little chemicals as possible. It's just the way I like to do it. But I do think in unfortunately, a lot of instances they're necessary. But yeah, so that's something I've thought about as well, is trying to do that. And beans, it can work really well. I mean, that's almost every year. I mean, that's kind of something you can count on. The structure of corn, I think just gives corn a leg up on the beans, in my opinion, because I feel like it makes a farm feel more secluded, and those deer feel safer, because there's all that structure. And then once again, the diverting and funneling factor that you can employ in a corn, or any, like I said, plot screen or anything like that, is just like, it's such a big deal. So I've kind of been leaning towards that more, though I think beans are great and they have their place as well.
And you got to have the room, you do have to have the acreage,
100%.
for either one of those, and in a lot of, like where I'm at up there, that's not even not an option at all. We're dealing with much, much smaller, carved out of the woods and things, and beans too. You got to plant a lot of beans, to stay ahead of the deer. If you have any, and I get that, question a lot too, that people want to put in an acre of soybeans, and I kind of, usually discourage them.
And I'm just curious, we'll go two scenarios, one fenced and one unfenced. How many acres of beans unfenced versus fenced do you think you would have to plant to, like, have beans late season left in, say, December in your area? Which I think you have a moderate deer density, it sounds like.
Yeah, I used to do them back when I lived in the central part, and you could do 5 acres of beans and still not have much
late season
left over they could browse those down.
It seems to check out. I feel like you need like 10. I mean, it depends on your deer density. And even if you fence an acre, once you take that fence down, man, they can clean it out pretty quick, especially if it's cold and there's even just like you think about a doe family group in there every night, all night, just hammer those beans, they can clear out an acre pretty quick. But that's, I guess, the biggest prohibitive thing about planting those grains, corn and beans, is just the acreage and then the cost. It's pretty significant. Whereas, like your blends are definitely more available and attainable for, most people.
Yeah, it's and if you got the room, I mean, and you have the acreage, to be able to do that, and it also is going to depend on what else you have around you. If you have the only 5 acres of soybeans in the county, they're, I don't even know if 10 would be enough. In that scenario, but if you had, other, if you're in semi-ag country or neighbors doing similar type things and stuff, that's all going to factor in. But and I've tried I used to try that fence that you'd spray with the deer repellent, and that tape, and you'd spray it with that stuff. And there would be times I'd go out there and the only deer in the field were inside the fence,
The only thing I've found to work is that double electric. But oh my God, they're such a pain to deal with, like to put them up
with, like,
and not only that,
with like a T-bar and. Put
Yeah,
the
or they
clips
have
on and stuff.
the nylon or poly nylon stakes or whatever, and they're
Yeah.
just like a pain to manage. And then like not only that, like you get a good flush of growth, and then you get weeds sitting there shorting out the fence, and the battery's dead. It's just like it drives me crazy.
Yeah.
I actually did put a fence up around finally, kind of too late around that cornfield I planted that the bears were getting to keep the bears out, and it did work. But it was almost too late.
A little too late.
Yeah. It did work, and I vowed before that I was never going to deal with an electric fence again. I'm like, I'm not doing it. But I was like, oh my God, these bears are killing me here. So,
How much were they eating?
I mean, that plot's not very big. It's weird because I had corn in it the year before, and I had corn. It's only like 1.3 acres. Of course, we have super low deer density.
Yeah.
And the corn did really well the year before. And I actually did seed Big and Beastie into that field as well because I had some areas that didn't come up well. Like you said, some areas where the corn struggled, that's a great place to do a fall, seed, regardless of if you're interseeding or not. But yeah, I mean, they ate like an acre, 1.3 acres of corn, and like from
Just flat.
late August.
They'll just lay down and.
Yeah, that's what they do. They come in and they just sit there and pull stalks and just make this big circle, and they just lay in it. It's like, and they're there all day. That time.
And I was told that they get like a stomach ache, and then they roll around.
Yeah.
Because their stomach hurts, and then they just knock that much more. That's why you see those big areas, just all flattened out.
Yeah, well, so
I was told that. I don't know if that's true or not, but I was told.
yeah,
That.
I don't
It
know
seems
if you
believable.
can. I don't know if you can up there, but we can run bear dogs in New Hampshire, and
Nope.
yeah, and the guys I know that run them, they start them in cornfields almost all like the biggest bears. They'll go down in a big, and we don't have that many cornfields, but they'll start them, and like that's where they find them, and then of course they leave and they run out of the cornfield and the dogs are on them, but they go and they start them in those cornfields because they're in the middle, just laying there eating corn just like all day long for like weeks in September and August and September. So, Well, anything else, John, you want to cover or talk about?
I think we've covered quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think we've covered, with the cover crops and stuff too. That was just something I wanted to touch on and that. And, but yeah, thought it was good.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on. I enjoyed it. I love this stuff. So I love to talk about it and experiment. And I think it's, it's like a journey, and you learn more and more and more and what works and what doesn't. And, I think the biggest thing, like we're saying, is you got to be flexible and know how to pivot and when to pivot, because it's never going to go exactly how you planned. And I mean, you must get the same thing that, I usually do, is like so many questions about people ask like, hey, I did this and this happened. What do I do now? And I have the same thing, and I always I'll bounce it off you or Eric. And be like, what do you think about this? And it's like never ending. It's never ending. But it's fun.
And that's the fun part. It is. There's really, a lot of, there's not really a wrong way sometimes to do things. And I mean, and if you, and too, if you found something that works for you, keep doing it, and, but yeah, it's fun to experiment. And like I said, early on about, tweaking the blends or using this blend with this blend, and like you with the interseeding of the corn. I mean, that's all great stuff, and when I'm usually when I'm sitting hunting in the fall, I'm already thinking about what I'm going to do in that plot next year. That's how I occupy my time, I just, this is what, and then of course they all get blown out of the water because, we go 7 weeks without rain. And
exactly.
And,
so, and you're back to seeding autumn quick plot and, the last week in September.
Exactly.
It seems like half the time that's what it comes to.
Yeah. And then it starts, and it starts freezing already at night, for us in middle of September or something, and then we're kind of, but it's all good. That's what's kept me in this. And that's what, that's kind of what gets me out of bed in the morning, and I like, discussing on the phone, and I spend a lot of time on the phone with people. And you can ask my wife, I get the eye roll a lot, when, she's ready for me to be done talking. But like I said, I learn a lot, and I ask people, and then when they say, I say, whether it's good or bad, or they call me, they have a problem, and we talk about a few things. I say, stay in touch. Let me know how that worked.
Yeah.
Did that work?
Yeah.
And send me some pictures. And usually, if somebody has a problem and the first thing they wanted, they'll, used to get this, I must have got a bad bag of seed, and, the likelihood of, is virtually impossible because, especially if there's a dozen varieties of seed in that bag, that they're all going to fail, that something else went on, so, and I like to try to help them out and find out what might have happened and things.
I'll tell you a bad bag of seed story that I had a couple of years back. I left a bag of Big and Beastie in a shipping container in August. And when I went in there, and I didn't even think about it because we were moving in the middle of a bunch of stuff that year. So I was like all over the place and probably missed a million things and thinking. But I remember when I opened that door, it must have been 150 degrees in that shipping container. And that, I think, had a very negative effect on the germination of that bag of seed because I was like, well, what happened there? And I started to think, and I was like, that may not have been the best idea to store, brassica seeds in 100
That's not ideal.
Is that the plot Ross sat in and it was just like dirt? Yeah.
Yeah. I've gotten some great, people that, when they talk about, especially like if it's something like pure trophy clover and they say, something else went wrong, because you can literally throw that out on your driveway and it's going to germinate. I had a guy send me a photo from his dryer, in his lint catcher in his dryer that it was growing. He had, stems coming out of it. My floor drain in my shop, and I have no windows in my shop. And you could go in there like, even in the winter where it drips off the tractor, the skid loader, and the clover starts growing out of the floor drain. And it's, like I said, it's completely, So I mean that stuff grows. So I usually, that stuff cracks me up. But so for the most part, we can find out if there's been a problem or anything like that. But and people, that's another question I really get a lot of is can I carry over seed? Yeah. And that's absolutely can, in the right condition, just take care of it, keep it, and cool and dry. And, I've had people that have had Big and Beastie that they forgot they had, and they'll find it and it's 4 or 5 years old and they'll ask if it's still good to seed. And I said, if it was kept in the right conditions, and if you want to take a few, 20 seeds and put them in a wet paper towel and, set them in a window or stick them in a flower pot or something like that. And
do a little germ test.
But
no, I think that makes sense. I think, if you're just to the germination thing, you think about like the weed seed bank that has been like, I remember we tilled up a plot in Ohio. It was like brush before we cleared it and tilled it, and alfalfa came back in it. And I remember talking to the guy who owned it. I was like, what's this from? Like, did you guys have alfalfa? He's like, not since we've owned it for the last 20 years. Like, so that seed, if it stays in the soil for decades, there's no, you can definitely store it, in the right circumstances, no problem. So, which is a really nice thing.
Yeah. They say that about some of the weed seeds, they can lay there for 100 years, waiting for you to open up that window, which usually mean, if you go in, remove the brush, spray off all the, existing vegetation, now, you've kind of opened the window, for them to grow. And we deal with that a lot where I'm at, and that just still amazes me. I'm in the middle of the woods up in northern Minnesota that, hasn't been ever probably, and we've cleared some spots and I get thistle growing, And one theory that one old timer told me was that he figured it was from the oats that they fed the horses back when they logged that 100 years ago. Jeez. That's where, because it's like, how does thistle end up, in the middle of it? I mean, I know too, it can blow through the air and things like that too. But that if I clear a spot, a brush, take the trees down, clear the brush, I know I'm going to be battling thistle.
Yeah, so seeds are pretty hardy for the most part, I would say.
Yeah. Yep.
Probably more than we give it credit
Yeah.
for. So.
You got to abuse them to
Right.
not get them to grow. So.
Yep. All right. Well, thanks for coming
All right.
on. I think
Yeah.
I
Anytime.
enjoyed it.
Anytime. I
Yeah.
enjoy this. So
maybe we can have you back, right in the heat of food plot season, maybe like July, to talk about maybe like the current situation of, and what people should do based on whether we're wet, dry, hot, whatever.
yeah.
And kinda,
Yep. Right in Nebraska season. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
That'd be good.
Absolutely. All right, John. Thank you.
All right. All right. Look forward to seeing what you come up with this year too. So
Absolutely.
Thanks for watching, guys. Like you said, we'll try and have John back on when it gets closer to planting time. If you got any questions, we can pull them up then. So just drop us a comment, or you can send us an email at justhuntpod@gmail.com. We'll make sure we read all those. And thanks for watching.
See you on the next one.